Welcome to Capitol View on WSIU. I'm Brian Sapp. The Obama Presidential Center opened to much fanfare last week. 3 former presidents joined musicians, civil rights leaders, and thousands of Chicagoans for the festivities. We'll talk with our guests about the former president and how this center could share his legacy. And the dust continues to settle on this spring's General Assembly session. Governor Pritzker's build plan, which aimed to address a need for affordable housing, met some opposition and did not pass. We'll talk about that. Joining us to talk about these issues are Dan Petrella. He's a reporter with the Chicago Tribune, and Kent Redfield. He's the political scientist professor emeritus at the University of Illinois, Springfield. Dan and Kent, it's good to talk to you. Good to see you guys. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Glad to be here.
Great. It was, as you know, in the newsroom, we had the TVs up, and I think all the stations had the wall-to-wall coverage at the Presidential Center last week. Dan, can you kind of fill us in on what happened, and we'll kind of move on from there?
Yeah, so the big grand opening ceremony that was invitation only was on Thursday, June 18th, and there was a big public watch party nearby out there on the south side, sort of near the University of Chicago. As you said, former President Obama, former First Lady Michelle Obama spoke, and we had former Presidents Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush all in attendance with their wives as well. Notably absent was the current president, Donald Trump, who was notably not invited to the event. Obviously, he has made a political career of attacking President Obama, built his political career off the birther myth, and that was really what sprang him into a real life in politics. So, it was a very celebratory event. It was interesting to look out over the crowd and see, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson there and Governor J.B. Pritzker there, obviously, but also former Congressman Bobby Rush, who Obama unsuccessfully challenged back in the early 2000s in a Democratic primary, and lots of other folks, all from throughout his course in both Chicago, Illinois, and national politics as well. It was a very joyful day for the Obamas. I think, there was some nostalgia. I think the president in his speech was careful to encourage people, not to just look back to the past, but sort of, hearkening back to his campaign themes, this idea of hope for the future and building a better America and things along those lines. One moment that really stood out to me was when Michelle Obama was speaking, actually, and took a shot at the current president with a reference to the fact that her husband had been awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. You could audibly hear Hillary Clinton laughing on the microphone in the audience. But it was a really star-studded event as well, with performances with 2 members of U2, and you had Bruce Springsteen, and you had Stevie Wonder and Common, and there's sort of a whole big wrap-up at the end with a lot of those folks all on stage together. And interestingly enough, afterwards, when the music ended, Joe Biden kind of walked up to the lectern and started to talk, and I think was sort of waving to folks in the audience, but it was one of those head-scratching moments that they let him get near an open microphone while the live stream was still going. But I think folks are hopeful for what it's going to mean for economic development things on the south side. There are also concerns about gentrification that might come along with it. But I think one of the other things is, if you're interested in going to see it and don't already have your tickets, it sounds like you're going to have to wait quite a while, because I think I just saw that it's sold out until something like November. But I will say, I just wanted to throw a shout out. I did notice my former State Journal Register colleague, Dean Olson, who's now at the Illinois Times in Springfield, there was one of the first 100 people in line, I believe, when it opened on June 19th, and was there when Michelle and Barack Obama surprised the folks who were among the first visitors to enter the museum.
Well, that's very cool. I keep reading that lots of people want to be able to go see it. Let's slide into that a little bit. What are some of the things you would look to see in the center, Kent? And what do you hope to see from the president?
Well, it's a fascinating concept. I mean, it is, if you've been to some other presidential museums, I mean, there's a wide contrast, and the only thing that I remember about President Johnson's museum when I was in Austin was that it didn't, it didn't look like a library, but it didn't look like much of anything else. Whatever you think of it, it is certainly a distinctive visual site in terms of what they've done. And I think, content-wise, well thought out. I think, the external architecture is problematic for a lot of people. So I think it's a wonderful thing to go and immerse yourself and they really have tried to do something that really brings people. You've got the president's office, the first lady's office, those sorts of things that you can kind of get those kinds of insights and feelings for. It is in some ways aggressive in terms of trying to make it more of a community sort of thing. It is, the size of the is actually pretty remarkable compared to, again, other presidential museums. The real question is, from a community standpoint, from a Chicago standpoint, are you going to have an impact on the surrounding community? And it's something positive that's happening at a time when Chicago is really struggling with, they're struggling with the Bears, but they're just struggling in general in terms of kind of, what is the future of huge urban areas post-pandemic and things. And so, the hope is this will be something that, that the city can build out from. And so that's, it's, 10 years from now, what's going to be there besides that it's a really neat place to visit. What's the impact outside of outside of the site itself.
Dan, I wanted to talk about one more question. The former president, moved to Illinois early in his 20s and dug in his career here. What do you think that he might be able to share and what people might be able to learn from, the president's center here?
Yeah, that was one thing that really stood out to me in his speech when I was watching the live stream online, is the way that he talked about how there really was no other place he could have built this center. And some might argue, well, he was born in Hawaii, he could have built it there, or that sort of thing. But obviously he had political beliefs and ideas that were developing before he came to Chicago as a young community organizer. But it was really here that he formulated this vision of himself as a political figure, as a political person. I mean, it was in the era of Mayor Harold Washington, and I think at sometimes earlier in his career, he saw, City Hall as his goal and that sort of thing. But, I think one thing I'm interested to see when I get a chance to go, I guess maybe early next year at this point, it sounds like, but is how the Chicago elements of the story are told. And I think from what I've heard from folks who have been, there's really, that's really woven into the narrative that the center is telling. And it's also, how, like you said, or like Kent was saying, how it's made itself part of the community. There's a branch of the Chicago Public Library that's part of the center, and there's a basketball court and things like that are inviting community in. So I'm really interested to see how it weaves Chicago into the overall narrative that doesn't just start with his birth in the 60s in Hawaii, but actually I believe from what I've heard goes all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. So I'm looking forward to it, and as a big fan of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield, I'm interested to, once I get to go see it, to kind of contrast the two and compare how they tell those stories.
Yeah, I think that will be probably a lot of people will be looking to see that story, and an adopted Illinois son, and he has such a gift to, and it seems like, to have transcended this, kind of trying to transcend, tell his story, and look forward, and I think it's seen in a lot of that. We're gonna switch gears, move on. Like I said, we're just under a month since the end of the session, and a lot of articles have come out looking at plenty of things. The Bears, that's still undecided. We're going to not touch on that this week too much. But one of the topics was the governor's build plan. It was a key part of his address in the spring, back in February. That didn't get passed. Kent, can you kind of tell us about this build plan and the governor's apparent failure of not getting this passed.
Yeah, I mean, we're all about affordability in our politics, and we're very cognizant of issues involving particularly, low income housing. This isn't a bill that really is in the middle, if you will, because what the governor was looking for was a way to promote uh, multi-unit, duplexes, triplexes, granny flats. The idea of building a house or a resident on existing property, and so to kind of fit in that area of, we're not talking about low income housing. We're not talking about, getting people into, areas above a starter home, but more in terms of if you can't afford a starter home anymore initially, then how do you get out into, some residential space? And so that distinguishes it from, other ways of thinking about housing. But to do that, it was proposing essentially a statewide uh, kind of zoning area, that where this would be a state law that would allow people to build these kinds of projects on pretty much any place in Illinois that's zoned residential. And what that, and it was not, this is something that really hadn't had a lot of spade work done. And so it caught a lot of people by surprise. And, you've got a state that has, since the 1970 Constitution, extremely broad local government powers. And zoning is something that, if you've ever been around City Hall, almost anywhere, that's the flashpoint. I've got my particularly residential, I want to protect my home and that sort of thing. And so they've got a lot of pushback on just exactly that. The Municipal League, who was the primary opponent, was saying, well, what we need is kind of a statewide guidance that people could opt into, that municipalities could opt into, that we'd incentivize with grants and things. It didn't help the presentation of the plan that it seemed to be coordinated with the Illinois Realtors Association, and so that you were really butting up against two pretty strong interest groups whose interests often don't don't coincide. And so it really did not get any traction. Lots of hearings, and it is a very tough nut to crack in terms of going in and saying we need some statewide kinds of restrictions on what local governments and communities can do on their zoning. It's good to have a housing plan if you're running for president, obviously, but this is going to need a lot of work, and it may end up looking a lot more like what the Municipal League wanted than what the governor initially proposed.
Dan, I wanted to touch on that. The Municipal League, like there was a little bit of stuff, but really they seemed to kind of come to the fore as the session went on. What does this say about their ability to make things happen?
Yeah, I think it really showed that they do wield a lot of influence with lawmakers in Springfield. They pushed back pretty hard on this plan, and I think one of the other issues that is an issue for them pretty much every year the legislature's in session, but the local governments get a share of state income taxes, and as the income tax rate has gone up, the amount that goes to the local governments has not gone up with it. And the governor had actually proposed giving them the same dollar amount in the upcoming budget, but cutting the percentage. So tax revenues have grown, and the state would be keeping more of that for itself to help balance its budget. And they managed to negotiate that out of the final budget package. But I think the fact that this plan, didn't get across the finish line in this session. It is indicative of a couple things. I think it's just like the governor said in his post-session press conference. Sometimes these big ideas do take, more than one session to get through. I think in some ways the governor's a little bit of a victim of his own successes in the past. Whenever everybody thinks back to the 2019 session when he first came into office and got all these huge things done in just a matter of months. Which kind of set maybe a high bar. But also, I think there's some criticism on this and other issues about how much the governor himself, personally was working lawmakers or on trying to, win their votes over. He spent a lot of time talking publicly about the plan, going to places like the City Club of Chicago and the Illinois Realtors Association and things like that, doing interviews with social media personalities and things like that on it. But I think there's questions on this and other issues with how much, individual lobbying of key lawmakers he's doing on some of these issues these days. But I do think, that I'm sure we'll hear more about this plan either throughout the campaign in the fall, or, maybe it'll come back up in veto or lame duck. Or obviously, assuming he wins the election in November, I'm sure we'll hear about it again in his budget State of the State address at the beginning of term 3.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of opportunity for the governor to work that, and I think your idea there. And as he said, let's just look at last year, the transportation issue that took. They didn't get that done in the spring, and it kind of lingered, and talks happened, and in the fall they were able to take care of it, and it's still up in the air to see how people appreciate it or like it, but it took a while for him to build that coalition to make it happen. Dan, I wanted to stay with you. Last week, the Illinois Prisoner Review Board had 4 new members join. Your colleague, Jeremy Gorner, wrote an article looking at the review board and some of the challenges as they're trying to move forward. Crime has become an issue. People argue whether the numbers really where they stand, but when people are hurt, it does make news. What are we looking at when it comes to the Prisoner Review Board?
Yeah, this is an issue that really has been a thorn in the governor's side for about 4 years now, for a lot of reasons. Back in zooming way back to 2022, when he was running for a second term, the Senate actually rejected one of his appointments to this board, concerns about qualifications, and at that time, crime rates were sort of at their post-pandemic peak or near their post-pandemic peak, and Republicans were campaigning that year very heavily on that issue. Obviously, the Safety Act had just been passed, and there's a lot of criticism over that, as I'm sure we'll hear again this fall. And then in 2024, I believe it was, the review board allowed the release of a man named Corsetti Brand, who had a history of domestic violence, and he went on to attack a former partner and kill her 11-year-old son. When the son came to try to defend her, he's now serving a life sentence in prison for that crime. But the Pritzker administration and the governor himself have faced a lot of criticisms over their appointments here. So there was a big revamp a couple of years ago of qualifications for the board, and so he was appointing folks to some vacancies and ran into a couple snags again. There was some criticism from Republicans over one of his nominees, Stephanie Love Patterson, who is a domestic violence prevention advocate, and some questions about a role that she had played with the national organization. She had checked on a form for her appointment that she was fired from her previous job, and then some of the Republicans on the committee that reviews executive appointments weren't satisfied with her answers about what happened there. Democrats defended it as sort of philosophical differences with the board of the organization, but sort of another road bump there. And then there was a former prosecutor from Sangamon County who had also done some work with the executive inspector general's office at the state, who faced some questions from Democrats about, her responses on questions about, are there any crimes that you would, automatically not let someone out of prison ever if they committed? And Democrats who are interested in criminal justice reform and ideas of rehabilitation rather than just the justice system being a tool of punishment, sort of balked at that, and she ended up withdrawing her name from consideration, and the governor withdrew her appointment. So the board is now, I think, up to 13 of the 15 seats being filled. But it's sort of this ongoing issue that comes up from time to time, as these folks weigh very difficult decisions where they're asked to review all sorts of records and hear testimony and somewhat predict the future, right? They have to make judgment calls about the likelihood that someone, if they are released, might commit another crime in the future, which is a very difficult thing to do, obviously. So and I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot about crime in the governor's race this fall. So more opportunities to scrutinize this board and who the governor has chosen to appoint to it. One of the changes they did make, I should say, is requiring background in criminal justice or being a defense attorney or a prosecutor, things like that for several of the members of the board.
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll have to look and see. Again, it's a process, and any crime is horrible and really harms those that it touches directly. And there's lots of rights to weigh, and it sounds like, I mean, in a way, I appreciate that. It sounds like the people are listening and that they're having some impact, and we'll just really have to see how that turns out. Turning to politics, we've got about 5 minutes left, and turning to politics, as you said, the campaign season, summer, before we know it, the state fair will be here. We'll have all the politicians out there and things like that. Last week, the AFL-CIO sent out an email saying that they were going to defer any endorsements. Kent, you've been around for a while here in Illinois. Can you help us make some sense of this?
Well, that's certainly got everybody's attention. Big labor is, the top dog in terms of certainly money that comes into Illinois politics. Absent, my billionaire versus your billionaire, which we seem to be past that stage at this point. And some of this is, they have some things that they would like to have happen. Generally, they have done very, very well under the governor. And we have a workers' right constitutional amendment. We took a significant things that labor wanted and enshrined them in the state constitution. So, the idea that there's trouble within the Democratic Party and its sponsors gets everybody's attention, but it is probably more, part of it is signaling. We're here. We would have liked to have done better. There are other issues having to do with unemployment insurance. Things that cost money for employers, unless it's state agencies. It's a different sort of thing, like non-educational or non-teaching kind of educational staff. Things, regular unemployment is money out of the pocket of businesses, and so those issues are always tough. Some of it is as our friend Rich Miller at Capital Facts talked about, is if you head up an association, you're not only managing the legislature, you're managing your members, and so you need to show your members that we understand that there are things out there that we want to do, and that we're going to go out and fight for you. Now, reforming Tier 2 at the cost of billions and billions of dollars is not likely at this point, but you're trying to do that, and so I assume we will come back together, and because it is pragmatic. I mean, we are, it is ultimately about getting elected, and in the case of labor, they generally do better if the Democrats are in charge. And so, but it is not, this is potentially an issue, Pritzker going nationally, is he may not be at the top of organized labor's list in terms of, who they'd like to see come out of the Democratic convention, and so this is going to be, we'll have to see what is sound and what is fury as we get back into really getting down to individual bills.
We've got just under a minute there, Dan. Don't mean to cut you too short, but Is this going to have a big impact on the fall or not too much? About
I
30
don't think we're
seconds.
going to end up seeing the AFL-CIO endorsing Darren Bailey in the governor's race for endorsing a whole host of Republican lawmakers. But I think it is significant. Obviously the governor has plenty of money to spend on his own race and his own political organization, but rank and file lawmakers do rely on union support. I think this also signals maybe some of the dissatisfaction with some of the more progressive unions under the AFL-CIO umbrella, with the lack of action on more progressive income tax structure, which is something they've been pushing for a long time. And the governor, says he supports, but since 2020, when his attempt failed, hasn't pushed publicly to really do anything about that. So I think obviously labor is a big tent, but it's going to be interesting to see how they come back together and if they fully embrace each other by November.
Yep, it's about 5 months away. Plenty of time to get it all figured out. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. It was good talking with you. On behalf of Dan Petrella and Kent Redfield, I'm Brian Sapp. Thanks for watching.